Hello and welcome to Sake Revolution, America's first sake podcast. I am your host, John Puma, the founder of thesakenotes.com, administrator of the Internet Sake Discord, all-around sake nerd.
And I am your host, Timothy Sullivan. I am a sake samurai, sake educator, as well as the founder of the Urban Sake website. And together, John and I will be tasting and chatting about all things sake.
So, Tim, what have you been doing to keep busy lately?
Well, you know, my work's changed a lot. I used to fly all over the place, but as many people have, I've been leading a lot of online webinars.
I can identify with that. There's absolutely no shortage of online sake webinars going on these days.
Yeah, I've been doing a lot of sake webinars too, and I'm really impressed with how many good sake questions people are putting in the chat at these webinars.
Yeah, it's kind of great to know what people are interested in hearing about.
You know, we should do that too. I think our listeners have some questions.
Well, let's do it then. We want to hear from you at home. If you have a burning sake question that needs to be answered, please send it over to feedback@sakerevolution.com so Tim and I can answer it right here on the show.
I'm really looking forward to see what people send in.
That's certainly going to be a good time, but for today's episode, I understand that the Sake Education Corner is going to be making its triumphant return.
Yes, we're doing part 3 of our series about sake production.
And what is part 3, Tim?
Well, it's Shubo.
Shubo, fantastic. What is it?
Do you know what Shubo means, literally?
I do not. Not literally, no.
Well, shu is one of the words for sake, and bo is one of the words for mother. So Shubo is actually the mother of sake. Some people call it the seed mash or the fermentation starter or the yeast starter, but it is the step of sake production where all the ingredients finally come together and we get fermentation.
The sake mother.
The sake mother.
So
Yeah.
a couple weeks ago we talked about Omachi being the grandfather. And now this is the mother. The family is expanding, Tim.
Yes. Just wait till we get to the second cousin.
I wait with bated breath.
Yeah. So the purpose of Shubo, there's another word for Shubo. There's always another word. Sometimes people say moto as well. M-O-T-O, moto.
Okay.
You can use
I've
them.
definitely heard that word.
Yeah, you can use them interchangeably. And so just a quick recap. We had rice milling. Then we had the rice preparation, washing, soaking, and steaming. And then we had our koji making. And once you have the koji made, you really have all the ingredients you need to begin fermentation. And Shubo is the first step in that process. I call it most often the fermentation starter.
Mm-hmm. I think I've also heard that terminology before. Probably in one of your education seminars.
The purpose for doing a Shubo, some people think it's, really to get the alcohol production started, but that's not really the reason you begin fermentation at this point. The purpose of Shubo is actually to grow the yeast colony before it goes into the big tank. The yeast arrives at the brewery in a little tube about the size of a chapstick. And there's already millions of yeast cells in there, but you need to grow it to billions of yeast cells. So they use this Shubo step to have a small tank, and they grow the yeast very carefully over generally a 2-week period. And that produces a really healthy, vibrant yeast colony that can then move on to the main deal, the main fermentation.
Yeah, I think the first time I ever visited a sake brewery, I didn't quite understand how that worked. And so they brought us into this room with these very small tanks, and they were working on, and there was a lot of foaming going on in there, and I'm very like, this can't possibly be the sake tanks. Like, they're not, these yields are too small. There's no way. And then it was explained to me that this was the starter. And then from there it goes into, and then we moved into the next room.
Yeah.
The big tanks.
Yeah. You have to think about it like this. If you put those yeast cells into a giant tank, they would spread out so much. It's like putting 7 people into a football stadium. They can't really connect with each other that well. But if you have them
in the age of social distancing, this is a good thing.
Well, we don't want to social distance our yeast.
Okay, we do not want to social distance our yeast, but we do now have an episode title.
Yeah, so we want to get the yeast together and growing, reproducing, and it's a great way to ensure that the yeast that go into the main tank are vibrant and there's a lot of them, and it will ensure a really healthy fermentation at the next step.
That's very interesting. Now, I understand that there's more than one way to do this, one way to accomplish this. What do we have? What are the options available to us?
Well, we're going to talk about 4 types of Shubo. The most common one is what we call Sokujo. Mm-hmm. Sokujo is used by about 90% of all sake production. It's called the modern, fast fermentation starter method. And this area gets a little bit technical, but one of the things that we add to the Shubo is lactic acid. Right. And lactic acid, I always explain it like this. If you think of the Shubo tank, the little Shubo tank, as a canvas,
sure.
When you put lactic acid in there, it's like an eraser or white paint that you put on the canvas. It cleans off everything and gives you a clean slate. Yeah. So what the lactic
wash.
Yeah, the lactic acid is killing all the wild bacteria and any stray yeast that got in there, and it gives the sake yeast a clean starting point. It's like clearing out all the riffraff and putting the sake yeast into a pristine environment. So adding lactic acid right before you add the yeast is ensuring that they have the best possible start. So that lactic acid addition is done manually for the Sokujo method. So they literally take some in a tube and they pour it in, and that kills all the wild yeast, wild bacteria, and the sake yeast can begin growing uninhibited.
But the lactic acid does not impact the sake yeast. That's interesting.
That's right. Sake yeast it actually thrives in a higher acid environment.
Ah, very interesting. Okay, that's fascinating.
Yeah. So the other types of Shubo are all variants about how to get the lactic acid into the fermentation starter. So the most common method is to purchase lactic acid. It comes in a liquid form and you just dump it in.
That sounds very straightforward.
Yeah, very straightforward. And that Shubo, we put in water, we put in the lactic acid, we put in regular steamed sake rice, and then we put in that koji rice, the molded rice.
Right.
And then all the yeast goes in on the first day. And then that begins fermentation. So that's the recipe for the modern fast method. And that takes 2 weeks.
That seems remarkably efficient for what's being done here.
Yeah. It's kind of amazing what you can accomplish in 2 weeks.
So what else do we have?
Well, there's the next most recent one is called Yamahai.
Okay.
And there's a related style called Kimoto. Kimoto is more ancient than Yamahai, but they have something in common. With Kimoto and Yamahai, they allow lactic acid to develop naturally over 2 weeks, and then they add the yeast, and it continues from there for another 2 weeks. So the Kimoto and Yamahai methods are a 4-week process, and the key difference is that those two allow for natural lactic acid buildup over time. They don't add it manually.
Well, that sounds like a bit more work.
Yes. And there's one difference between Kimoto and Yamahai that differentiates them.
And what would that be?
Kimoto sake, when they put the rice and the water in at the very beginning, they use these long poles to mash the rice and the water together. Uh-huh. And they thought for many hundreds of years that you needed to mash the rice and water together or it wouldn't work. But then around 1900, 1910, they discovered that if they just let it sit there and raise the temperature a little bit, you would get the same development of lactic acid. So there's the Kimoto method, which has been around for a really long time, and that's where they do this pole ramming. They mash the rice with these long poles. And then Yamahai is the method that came after that, where they just stopped that pole ramming and they allowed lactic acid to develop naturally.
I mean, Kimoto sounds like even more work.
Yes.
Now as a pole.
Yes. You have to picture like a long pole with a brick-shaped block at the end of it. And they would use that to mash the rice and water together and create like a slurry. And they thought that would help kickstart this whole process to work really well. But when science advanced a little bit in the early 20th century, they figured out, let's just leave it as is and raise the temperature a little bit. And then it got to...
I like the idea that somebody was just like really tired one day and was like, wait a minute, guys, what if we just don't do this part? Let's see what happens. What's the worst that can be?
There's actually songs that they would sing to keep time when they're mashing. So it's like a very laborious process. So, yeah. But
it seems like it. I have seen photos of the Kimoto pole mashing, and it does not seem like a good time.
Yeah.
It seems like a tremendous amount of physical labor and a lot of work.
Yeah. So things have gotten progressively easier. But did you know there's even a more ancient method than Kimoto?
Does it involve poles?
Well, we can call it the grandfather of Shubo. So this is the grandfather of the sake mother.
So this is the grandfather on the mother side. All right, got it.
So I think in a past episode we featured what's called a Bodai-moto. And this is also referred to sometimes as monk's sake, because this yeast starter method was developed by monks in Shinto shrines.
And how does it differ from the Kimoto?
What we do is we take some rice and some water and we let it soak in a small tub. And over the days that it's soaking, the water becomes rich in natural lactic acid. So lactic acid is going to develop naturally in there. After about 3 days, they remove the rice and separate the water and rice. The rice is then put into the moto tank, and the lactic acid-rich water is then mixed in there with some koji rice, the yeast, and they begin the shubo in that way. So they're creating this lactic acid-rich water that gets put in to start fermentation. And that's one of the key differentiators. The Kimoto method kind of refined that even more. And then they moved on to Yamahai and then Sokujo. So there's a clear development over time of this fermentation starter.
Nice. All right. Well, Tim, thank you for that rundown. I actually, to be honest with you, I don't know as much about Shubo as I probably should. And now I know quite a bit more. As we are known to do on the show, we have brought along some sake, and this week we've got some uncommon Shubo method sakes, if I'm not mistaken.
That's right. Why don't I go ahead and introduce mine, and then you can tell me what you have?
Sure.
But I brought along a sake called Dan, D-A-N, like Dan's the man.
Dan is the man.
It's called Dan Yamahai Junmai Ginjo. So this is that Yamahai style that I told you about. This is a natural development lactic acid style, but it doesn't do the pole ramming. It doesn't do the mashing of the rice beforehand.
Okay, no pole. Got it.
That came into being around 1910s or so. And that indicates to me, when I see Kimoto or Yamahai in the name, that indicates to me that I might look for something a little bit earthy, a little bit funky. Mm-hmm. And so that's the one I brought. What do you have today?
I brought a sake from a brewery called Amabuki in Saga Prefecture. And this is their omachi. Right, there's a theme, guys. There is a theme lately with John. This is their omachi Kimoto Junmai Dai Ginjo. So I went kitchen sink on titles for this week, I think. And this is a very exciting and interesting sake that I cannot wait to start sipping and talking about.
Awesome.
Yeah.
So why don't you go first? You can go ahead and pour and let us know about the aroma and the taste for your sake.
Sure. So the aroma is it's still very floral. A little bit of kind of honeydew. It's it's sweet on the nose. It's kind of nice. It's very different. It's very unique. And then the flavor is just wildly complex. There's so much going on here. So a few weeks back, we talked about that omachi note that we have a hard time truly describing. And that's there, but it's not alone. It's brought friends. There's bits of melon, strawberry. It's complex and moving. It's always changing while it's in your mouth. This is a very interesting and unusual sake. So taking this ancient method, this very rich rice, and then they're milling it down to 46%. So it's still very luxurious while it's made from all these very ancient components. It makes a very interesting juxtaposition. And it is really a lot of fun to drink.
And one thing I think we can't skip over when we talk about this brand Amabuki is that they use flour yeast for all of their sake.
That's right.
Like their signature thing. So the yeast that they use to actually ferment the mash is cultivated off of different types of flours.
That is the fun thing about Amabuki, is that they're always doing that. It's always interesting.
Yeah, and for the Junmai Daiginjo Kimoto, the flower is the rhododendron.
I have that in front of me, and I was going to casually skip saying it because I couldn't pronounce the word right.
Rhododendron. It's a mouthful.
Rhododendron. Thank you.
Yes. I could not tell you what it looks like, but the fact that they get all their yeast off of flowers, other styles they make, they use strawberry blossom, and it's just amazing that they've been able to get these really complex flavors using this really unique yeast. Yeah. Most breweries do not do this. They buy yeast from suppliers.
Yeah, that is truly one of the more interesting things about Amabuki, and we should dive into that a little bit more in a future episode.
Yeah, they're a super interesting brand.
So Tim, let's sip on the Dan. Let's talk about that.
All right. So this is, as we mentioned before, a Yamahai Junmai Ginjo. Mm-hmm. And the brewery name is Sasaichi.
Sasaichi. Okay.
And they're from Yamanashi Prefecture.
Yamanashi Prefecture. We don't get that much sake from there, do we?
Yeah. Yamanashi, I think, is really well known for the wine grapes that grow in Japan. So there's certain types of wine grapes that grow. And I think Yamanashi is well known as the one area in Japan that has wine tradition. But,
very interesting.
Yeah. This has a 55% rice milling rate. Mm-hmm. I'm going to give it a smell. So it has a wonderful kind of apple pear smell to it.
Ooh, that's
I think
nice.
Of crisp fruits that you bite into and you get that crunch, the apple, green apple, pear. Really lovely. It's a fruitiness, but it's not that tropical melon, banana. It's much more crisp fruits. Really delicious. And let's give it a taste. Oh, wow.
Oh,
it's
yeah?
really rich. Feels very, very full. It almost feels a little Nama-esque. Like there's a little bit of that rich, juicy characteristic that you get in Nama. It doesn't have the brightness of an unpasteurized sake, but it has that rich, really coating. The alcohol percentage is only 16.5, so it's not super high in alcohol, but it's very dense and rich. And guess what? The rice is our old friend, Grandpa Omachi.
Oh, no. So at this rate, we're going to have to rename the show Omachi Revolution. And I have no regrets.
I actually bought this sake not knowing that. But yeah,
I knew,
I have no regrets either.
I forgot that sake had omachi.
Yeah. So this is there's a lot going on with this sake. Really, really fun, juicy, full-bodied. But I'm trying to think of something to pair it with. And
I don't even know.
Yeah, it's like a meal in itself.
Yeah.
There's so much going on. But I think I would pair it with richer foods for sure. For sure.
That's interesting. In my case, though, the amabuki, even though it's omachi, it is a Junmai Daiginjo. It is very lush and very luxurious. And I'm terrified to mess with it. I would not want to give it any hard flavor, any strong flavors. Maybe, some grilled fish, maybe some white fish with this, but I would not want any strong, nothing really. This is staying away from my meats, from my beefs and whatnot. This is staying away from the spicy food. I might actually try to keep this away from food in general, but if I want to pair with something, I do something that is inoffensive, like grilled fish.
John, I wanted to ask you about the texture of your sake. Because it's a Junmai Daiginjo, that's like super premium grade, and the rice milling is so low. When I hear that, I think, super silky. Is it lighter in texture or richer in texture?
It's kind of plump and viscous.
Yeah.
It's very luxurious. It coats the mouth. There's a lot going on.
Yeah.
When you mill that sake down to 40%, things are going to happen, especially when you combine it with these, ancient methodology, this heritage style rice, and then on top of that, flour yeast. It's such a unique and interesting sake. It's completely unlike most things I've ever had.
Yeah, there's a lot going on, and it sounds like compared to a very traditional Junmai Daiginjo, this has so many more layers.
Absolutely. When you think of Junmai Daiginjo, you think of something that's very kind of light and refined and fragrant. And this is, this is a little bit light. It's still very luxurious feeling, but it's so complex and so interesting and so different that it's really not like most other Junmai Daiginjos that I've ever tasted. It's probably a lot different from a lot that are out there.
Yeah. So if people are looking to try Kimoto's, Yamahai's, or Sokujo's, or Bodai-moto's, any of the fermentation starter styles that we talked about today, I can tell you that the Sokujo, the modern method, is about 90% of sake production. The Yamahai, the style that I had, is about the next 9%. And Kimoto is only about 1% of sake made. So Kimoto, the most labor-intensive of the most recent three styles, is the rarest because it has the most labor involved. And the Bodai-moto is really just produced by a few places in the country. It's very rare style of sake. So that is something you really have to seek out as a specialty niche product. But for Kimoto, Yamahai, and Sokujo, depending on the amount of labor involved, they're increasingly more available. The easier they are to produce, yeah. Well, I think that about wraps it up for this episode. I want to thank all our listeners so much for tuning in. And if you can, please take a moment to rate our show on Apple Podcasts. It'll really help us out a lot.
Yeah, it is. I think Apple Podcasts is still the best way to get the word out about podcasts. Unless, of course, you just tell a friend, which you should. And also tell your friends to subscribe wherever they download their podcasts so that you do not miss an episode, and neither does your friend.
And as always, to learn more about any of the topics or sakes that we talked about in today's episode, be sure to visit our website, sakerevolution.com, for all the detailed show notes.
And as we mentioned earlier, if you have a sake question that you need answered, we want to hear from you. Reach out to us at feedback@sakerevolution.com. So until next time, please remember, keep drinking sake and
Kanpai!